This is Ant-Man from RV Daily Magazine, and we're doing an interview with Roger Beamers from Long Range Automotive in Melbourne. Roger, thanks for coming along.
Thanks, Ant-Man. Good to see you.
What I'd like to do first is, you're celebrating your 30th year in manufacture of tanks this year.
30 years, where did that go? I mean, we met each other originally probably back in 1995.
Was?
And so Anthony and I started the business back in 1989 and in October. So yeah, this October is going to be 30 years of LRA here in Lilydale, in the same street actually.
In the same street? Well, when I met you, it was in this street across the road.
We've managed to keep the same phone number all that time, but this is actually our fourth location in the same street.
Where did you guys actually start? What was the focus behind you guys starting business?
Okay, so obviously, as you know, I do it together with my brother Anthony, and we'd always talked about doing something together as we were growing up. He's actually a boilermaker by trade, and my background is smash repairs, panel beating and body repairs. Anthony was doing cut-down petrol tanks for LPG converted vehicles. So back in the late 80s, early 90s, when the LPG was quite popular, so for a few of the local LPG converters, he was cutting petrol tanks in half to so that they could remove half the petrol tank, put the LPG cylinder there, and then go on with that. And that then developed to back in when the GQ Patrol first came out. So in order to convert a GQ Patrol to LPG, you needed a new petrol tank. So that was a whole different ball game, and some of the LPG converters weren't happy with where they were able to source that product from, and asked us whether we could manufacture those as well. So that meant a little bit more than just after hours work. So we rented a small factory, bought some equipment, and commenced manufacture of petrol tanks mainly for the LPG industry to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
And then of course a gas conversion petrol tank for a Nissan GQ Patrol can easily become a diesel auxiliary tank for a Nissan GQ Patrol. So that's where the auxiliary tank market started for us, and then of course replacement tanks come out of that, and nowadays we just solely doing long range tanks, nothing really for the LPG industry anymore.
Mm-hmm. It's still a very big market that you work with out there, you know, in the four-wheel drive side of things especially, and you know, four-wheel drive, two-wheel drive, some of the SUVs, the bigger SUVs.
That's right. Predominantly now it's like tanks for 200 series, diesel 200 series Land Cruiser, Hiluxes, Ford Rangers, Tritons, Navaras, plus some of your SUVs like your Ford, and even things like Isuzu MUX, and yeah, but predominantly it's the more traditional dual cabs and larger four-wheel drives that we're doing.
Excellent. All right, well look, congratulations on 30 years of being in business, because, you know, as you know, manufacturing in Australia has gone south a long way, and there's not too many Australian manufacturers making, you know, products for Australians and what we can do, so congratulations.
Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks.
So we're talking with Roger Beamers from Long Range Automotive. Roger, when we talk about replacement tanks and auxiliary tanks and things like that, what would you say to people if they're looking for a tank? What are some of the points that they should consider when looking for a tank? Because we know there are various different tanks on the market, poly, steel, but what should they look for?
I guess first of all they need to look for a quality product, something that's being made by a quality manufacturer, and that's important. You need to look at the what are your actual needs? What do you need this tank for? Is it a Simpson Desert trip? Is it a Canning Stock Route trip? Is it being able to just that I need the fuel when I'm towing my caravan because I can't make it between fuel stations and I'm nervous that I'm not going to be able to make it to the next point? Is it that comfort factor? Is it the money saving factor? Is that important to you? Because you can the litrage price can vary by 20, 30, 50 cents a litre depending on where you're fueling up. So you've got to also consider the fit up of the tank, the ground clearance. Are you still getting good ramp over angle for the centre of your vehicle? Have you still got good exit angles? Do I need to, if I get the long range tank, do I need to relocate my spare wheel? Just things like that.
Mm-hmm. So there's there is a lot to consider. I think going back over a couple of those points, most towers, because we're obviously with RV Daily, we're a towing mag, but most people that are buying vehicles to tow with have to put a tow bar on. So if they're thinking about what they're doing with fuel first, they would be able to then buy something that incorporates a rear wheel carrier. So it means that they not adding extra weight and can move that fuel tank, the spare wheel, a lot easier.
That's right. So say for a 200 series Land Cruiser, which is quite a popular tow vehicle for a dual axle caravan, they would use that replacement of the sub tank on a 200 series that can get you up to 263 litres on board. But that does require you to relocate the spare wheel onto the rear. So you would need a wheel carrier and then the replacement sub tank.
And the other thing, I guess, which is important while we're talking about towing, and that's weights really. I mean, there's a lot of things in the marketplace that say, okay, yes, if you put this sort of tank in, it weighs this much, add in the extra, say 90 litres of fuel above and beyond standard. The people don't understand that actually comes off their payload for the vehicle as well.
Yeah, so weight's a big factor these days. I mean, even in your RV Daily publication, they cover that quite extensively, and GVM and also gross combined mass are very important these days, and people need to have an understanding on everything they add to their vehicle has an effect on that.
Yeah, and as you said earlier too, just because your roof can take 100 kilos, if you put 100 kilos on the roof, it's still 100 kilos of payload that you can't put anywhere else.
Yeah, so you can't have everything.
Mm. I think that's an important point is getting that. So understanding what your ultimate goal is, like you said before, about is it towing and reduced fuel usage. By in some cases considerable, which means you won't get from one major town to another major town to get fuel.
That's right, because sometimes if you're like pulling a van and you're going into a headwind, you'll be struggling to actually get there. I've had customers tell me that they could hardly make it to the next fuel fill up. So for them, then the extra capacity of the long range tank becomes a necessity, not so much a luxury.
Exactly. So now going back then to the difference, so the main two types of tanks that are on the market are a poly style tank, plastic, and steel. There are several manufacturers that cover sort of both segments. Mm-hmm. If we're looking at understanding what would be the questions that you would want to ask, or would a person looking at the difference between the two tanks, what would they want to ask as far as why would I go for one over the other?
Okay, so you'd want to ask, does the tank have baffles inside it? Mm-hmm. Especially, to stop the fuel transfer of weight with fuel moving around, being able to keep the fuel around the fuel pickups while the engine is running. So that's an important consideration. Does the tank have a drain plug in it? I mean, how many times don't you hear that somebody, they're at the servo, they put unleaded into their diesel vehicle and all of a sudden it's like panic stations because they've got no way of getting that fuel out of the tank. Then it becomes a tow truck job, back to a workshop. So does it? Or if you get some contaminated fuel, how do you deal with that if the tank doesn't have a drain plug? So that's an important consideration.
Yeah, I think they're very important. I mean, yes, we acknowledge that a polyplastic style tank will be lighter, and I think we sort of discussed somewhere between maybe 15 and 20 kilos depending on the tanks, obviously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But is that going to be any real saving? Yes, it's 15, 20 kilos, but you've got to look at whether that's what you're actually after. Will a poly tank handle the same conditions as a metal tank if you're serious four-wheel driving? You know, if you're going to go and bash them, I mean, bash one or bash the other, and a seal's likely to dent more than anything else.
Yeah, and you've got to remember the fuel that you put in either tank weighs the same, so there's no weight saving with just because it's only in the shell. So, you know, when you've got diesel that I think comes in at around 700 grams a litre, and that weighs the same whether you're putting it in a steel or a poly tank.
Okay.
You've got, you know, with a steel tank, you've got some scope for being able to modify it for, you know, we've had cases where, you know, say on a Ford Ranger where somebody has a second battery mounted up under the chassis rail, where the aftermarket poly tank would be not suitable because it encroaches in the area where the battery is, where we can manufacture an aluminised steel tank that's, you know, just a little bit shorter to cope with that. So you do have some scope for being able to modify, and also to be if the need arises, you can repair an aluminised steel tank, whereas being able to repair the poly tank becomes not impossible, but you try to find somebody who's able to do it. You know, then that's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah, and that's again another important point if you're doing remote travel. As far as I can say, anyway, you sort of got to be able to find repairers, deal with that sort of stuff. It's getting harder and harder with modern vehicles to just fix stuff in the outback now.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah,
For
it's
sure.
normally pick up and tow away.
Sometimes it's just open the bonnet and then they close it again.
Well, yeah, I've seen that happen. So I think then the other thing, I guess, when we're looking at all of this sort of stuff is I did hear at one point that some of the poly tanks only handle diesel fuel, not petrol at this point.
That's correct. Yeah. So the type of material that they're using to make them out of is only suitable for diesel.
Yep. And the other thing I think too, and this is something you mentioned earlier, is that, you know, people are realising diesel's not the super clean fuel that they thought it was, and there's going to be more petrol powered vehicles on the road.
I think we'll see a return of petrol in touring vehicles. It'll be making a comeback because, as you say, the diesel is not the clean green fuel that it was, you know, seen. Petrol is, and the fuel economy that they're getting out of petrol vehicles is quite good. So I think we'll see petrol will come back into play.
And I think petrol's more readily available in the outback these days compared to, you know, 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah, well, I've just come back from a 10,700 kilometre trip, and there wasn't anywhere where you couldn't buy petrol.
So it's not like remote stations used to be where they only had diesel because everything ran on diesel. Yeah. They are carrying a bit of both. I'm interested in one of the points you made too about having extra fuel. So the whole point behind having any sort of long range tank, regardless of whose it is you're doing away with the need for jerry cans.
That's right.
I came across a Lexus 4-wheel drive out in the Madigan line, and he had 8 full jerry cans on his roof, plus a couple of gas bottles. I think exceeding that actual roof rack capacity.
Yeah, well, he would be. Just the fuel alone would exceed that.
And when I suggested that he's coming into a very rough area and that he should probably use as much fuel out of those jerrys as possible to stop that sway, he just sort of laughed at me and drove off. But you did mention that getting that weight off the roof is really important for a whole lot of reasons, but also getting having a tank underneath drops your weight down.
Well, that's right. If you're going to add weight to a vehicle, the best place to add it is as low as possible, so which is, you know, under the vehicle. And, you know, for your towing people who have always got a lot on the ball weight, if you can add weight in front of the rear axle, it also helps to counterbalance the vehicle somewhat. It doesn't change the payload, but it does push that weight a bit further forward.
Further forwards, yeah. And, you know, in a lot of cases we might only be talking, an extra 120 odd kilos in the middle of the vehicle in front of the axle.
That's
for
right.
some of your bigger tanks. Yep. So that's a really good point. So not high where we get big top end sway.
Pendulum effect.
Yeah. And down low and towards the centre of the vehicle in front of the axle, so it really is balancing and stabilising the vehicle a lot better. All right, so we've covered a whole lot of different things about different tanks, what to look for. Mounting points are really important. So you did mention too, when we were talking about the quality of the tank someone's getting, or is the ability for it to be fit for purpose.
Considerations when you're selecting a tank is, how is it mounted? Are the mounts adequate to be able to cope with the extra weight? Has it been engineered well? Not just perhaps maybe just hanging back on the original mounts. Does it have additional mounts, and are the mounts up to speed for carrying the extra weight of the tank and the fuel?
That's the thing, because on a highway, if you're just towing a caravan, it's probably not as critical as if you're going down the Canning, or as you know from some of the Gulf roads, some of the roads up north in the northwest of the country, the Gibb River and stuff like that. I mean, the corrugations alone, if you've got 140 kilos sitting there trying to bounce off your chassis, it's it can do a lot of damage if it's not mounted correctly.
Yeah, and you don't always want to mount things too rigidly either, because the chassis do have flex in them. So you've got to you have to give all those considerations, and that's what comes into the design of each tank.
All right. So the last point I think that I should make, we touched on it a bit earlier, is things like your ground clearance versus your ramp over angle, and departure angles, approach and departure angles. They will apply to caravanners, because caravanners are now starting to head off places where we've never seen them before with their caravans, but also they've got all that weight over the tow bar, so that really can have an impact on what happens there.
So I met a customer just this week who'd come back from a trip, and he was towing I think it was a 18 foot double axle van behind a 76 series Land Cruiser, and he'd been out to Columbaroo, and people said, well, how'd you get that caravan here? And he goes, well, I towed it here. And some people were amazed at where he was able to actually tow that van into. But so they're considerations to make when you're looking at the ground clearance of the tank and the exit angle, that those things are considered in the design, and that they're going to serve you well when you're out there.
Well, because as I know you've towed with trailers and things, and before, sometimes getting in and out of places is really hard, because then you've got that A-frame and the tow ball wanting to dig into the ground, and right. It does become really tricky. So that's all good points. Is there anything else you think is important for people to consider when it comes to getting a long range tank in their vehicle?
I think, just it's probably one of the only accessories you put on your vehicle that you're going to be able to save some money with.
True. Especially
your bull bar doesn't give you any money saving. I guess it might save you from repairs if you hit an animal or something. So, but the tank, I've just come back from a trip to the Gulf and the Cape, and being able to fuel up diesel at $1.43, and then being able to drive past the place where it was $2.05. That's when you're pumping in 150 litres. That's a significant saving.
And that's a consistent saving too.
Yeah.
I mean, really, that to me, that's one of the biggest advantages of a tank. You can pick your time when fuel's the lowest, take advantage of any fuel offers you've got, fill it up to your 150 litres, and then you drive for the next 2-3 weeks.
And sure, it costs more fuel to carry more weight. I mean, the more weight you put on the vehicle, it's always going to, the law of physics says it's always going to cost more to push that along. But not nowhere near to the amount of savings that could be made by being able to buy that fuel at a cheaper price. Plus, you're buying it in larger regional centres, so you've got less chance of fuel contamination. You can buy from your BPs and your Mobiles, and know that you're getting quality fuel at a reasonable price.
Yeah, which is a really good point, because and it comes back to again, if you're planning what you're doing and you're following fuel apps and all the rest of it, you can work out where you can, it might only be $10 a load, but over a long trip,
Oh, that's right.
there's enough accommodation, you know, for one night or 2 nights that you can pay for, that you don't have to swag it.
That's right.
You know, and I think for caravanners, the savings will really benefit them if they can get further distances.
Yeah, I think that for
Centres.
caravanners especially, it's because you've got those vehicles that really good fuel economy around the town when they haven't got their van on. But once they've got the van on and they might struggle with a headwind or something, and it makes them nervous sometimes, thinking, am I going to make it to the next fuel service station? So yeah, that peace of mind as well, of being able to know that they've got enough fuel to get them through.
Well, that's it. All right, on that note, Roger, thank you very much for sharing your time with us, explaining about the advantages and disadvantages of long range tanks and the different types. Much appreciated, and have a lovely afternoon.
No, thanks, Anthony. Good on you. Cheers.